and welcome to the Community Builders webinar series. My name is Allison Berry, and I will be your moderator today. We also have Kathy Trauger on the line, and she will jump in if we have any technical issues. Today's webinar is why everybody talks about transportation safety, but nobody does anything about it. We have with us today Jim Charlier, president of Charlier Associates. Welcome, Jim.
Hello, thank you, Allison.
Jim is a transportation planner with more than 30 years of experience in local, regional, and statewide settings across the country. Today, we will be learning about transportation safety and identifying strategies that local governments and advocacy groups can use to track and report safety facts. But first, a bit of background about Community Builders. We're excited to announce that as of January 1st, Community Builders is an independent nonprofit organization. As such, we will continue to bring you great webinars every month, in addition to continuing our work in research, training, and assistance, all aimed at helping local leaders to create more livable communities in the American West. For more information about Community Builders, as well as our blog, research, publications, and more, check out our website, which is communitybuilders.org. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted later this afternoon, and we will also post today's PowerPoint slides if you would like to access those. Those of you who are familiar with our webinar series may have been with us for one of our previous webinars with Jim Charlier, but for those of you who missed them, I encourage you to check them out on our website when you have a chance. So for today, if anyone has any questions during the presentation, you can submit them through the questions panel on your screen, and we'll answer as many as time allows for after the presentation. And with that, we can get started, and Jim, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Allison. So our topic today is a controversial one, and one that is becoming more so, I think, which it probably needs to. I chose a provocative title, Why Everybody Talks About Transportation Safety but Nobody Does Anything About It. Of course, that's not fair. A lot of people are working very hard on this. A lot of people are doing a lot about it. But I think we all kind of share some frustration with some of the choices being made, and sometimes we're puzzled about just the topic and the data and the trends. And I think we need to all get smarter about it, including me. I've done a lot of work to prepare for this, and I've learned a lot myself. So that's kind of, I chose a provocative title. We'll come back to this at the end and see how we feel about it then. The topic today is streets and kind of all the street modes. We don't have time, and it would be too much to try to do to address all these other topics. These are important too, but we won't be getting there. There will be a recurring theme that I want to call your attention to before we even get started. That's, I think, pretty important, and I'll touch on it off and on as we go along. And that is that we get in trouble on this topic when we don't think enough about the fact that most human behavior is driven by subconscious, and people make choices and decisions that perhaps they shouldn't, but they do. And when engineering practice, it tries to lay down rules and assumptions that go contrary to human nature, that's when we have a especially difficult time with street safety. And that's kind of a strange point to make early, but I think you'll see as we go along why I think that's important. So our topics today are, we're going to start looking at trends. Most of our time will be spent here on design factors, which are extremely important, and that's sort of where the rubber hits the pavement, so to speak. I'll talk a little bit about standards and guidelines, AASHTO greenbook, and how we think about all of that, and make some points about data and reporting, and then wrap up. So here we go. The trends, you've been reading about this in the papers quite a bit. I want to make a point about terminology. I've been a transportation planner actually more than 40 years now, and most of that time I've been using the word accidents. And we're sort of moving away from that. And I'll probably slip up today because it's hard to change, but we're talking now about crashes and collisions. And the reason there's actually a pretty important point behind that, which is we're realizing that a lot of our fatalities and injuries are the direct result of personal choices. If I drive down an arterial street with sidewalks and crosswalks at a high rate of speed above the speed limit, and I strike a pedestrian, yes, it's an accident, perhaps, in a certain sense, but I think there's impatience with the idea that it's somehow excusable or somehow not, just those things happen. And I think we do need to kind of get away from that mindset. So I'll be using the word crashes most of the time unless I lapse and happen to say accidents. In the data, we primarily organize crash data by property damage only, which are just, fender benders, personal injuries where somebody gets hurt, and fatal crashes and fatalities. So you'll see us jumping back and forth between those different kinds of data. We'll talk a lot about number of crashes, but we'll talk more about crash rates, which helps a lot to sort of normalize for population, normalize for travel. And so we talk about crash rates in two ways. We talk about how many crashes there are per mile of travel, and because we have a lot of travel, we talk about the crash rate per 100 million vehicle miles. And I believe everybody on the call probably knows what a vehicle mile of travel is. But it's also taught to think about it in terms of exposure. And so if you have a city of 100,000 people, what's the chance that you might be killed as a pedestrian by a motor vehicle? And so the rate per 100,000 population, both of these are very helpful. And again, we'll jump back and forth between how and on every slide you'll be able to tell which it is. So in terms of actual fatalities, and these are fatalities, not fatal crashes, these are people. We've had significant improvement over the last 50 years or so. The number of annual fatalities in the United States from motor vehicle crashes, traffic crashes, peaked in 1970. We've had a bit of an upsurge in the past few years. Part of that is because our vehicle miles of travel is booming. 2015 looks like it was probably the biggest year ever for motor vehicle traffic in the United States. And as the traffic goes up, obviously the number of crashes go up. But the fatality rate has dropped steadily since we started keeping records. Or let me say it has dropped since we started keeping records, and it has dropped precipitously for some decades, kind of flattened out. We got serious about some things, it dropped some more, and now it's the rate of decline has sort of slowed in the past few years. And it's useful to think about, well, what has improved? How did this happen? How did we get so much improvement? Because what most people believe, it turns out not to actually be the case. So I'll spend a couple of minutes talking about this, and I'll talk about four factors: rural roadways, drivers, vehicles, and urban streets. And how did we make all this progress over the last 100 years? We've made an enormous amount of progress on rural roadways. We've worked on it steadily. The state DOTs, the engineering profession, the various professional organizations have spent, and the U.S. government have spent millions and millions of dollars improving the safety of rural roadways. Everything from shoulders to guardrails to pavement markings to the actual design of the roadway itself. We've also, when we were first driving cars, it just pretty much anybody could get in there, reach the pedals, could drive, and we changed that, obviously. You now go through pretty rigorous training and licensing and testing. We've also done drunk driving laws, but maybe most importantly, actually, when you look at fatalities, believe it or not, is that our emergency services and our urgent care services have gotten a lot better. So we still have some pretty serious crashes, but we're better at keeping you alive when it happens. And that shows up in the data. We don't think about it, but it's actually an important factor in the data. And our vehicles are better. If you think about it, seatbelts, airbags, requiring child protection, child safety and so forth. Our frames are amazing today, what they're able to do to protect our passengers. Our fuel tanks don't explode. All the Pintos are off the road by now, hopefully. The interior finishes don't catch fire, and so forth and so on. And we're continuing to spend a lot of time and money on this. This is going to continue to improve. So our vehicles are better. They're safer. We avoid accidents. There I go. We avoid crashes a lot more than we used to, and we survive them more than we used to. Urban streets, not so much. We have, traffic signals are better than uncontrolled intersections, and we have better intersection lighting and better pavement markings. And roundabouts have had some positive impacts on vehicle-to-vehicle crashes. But the bigger story really is that we have not had that much improvement in crash rates on our urban streets. And so I'm going to spend a lot of today's webinar talking about why that is. So when we look at this curve and we say, boy, that looks really great, and that's the way you see it in the newspapers too. Fatalities are falling, or happy days are here. That's true, but what's also true is that most of that, and I put this whole quote in here so that people understand this is not me editorializing, this is what the research shows. Most of that improvement has come as a result of those things I just showed you, but very little of it is because our streets are safe. Our streets are, in fact, not safer. In fact, it's hard to measure this because you get some streets are safer and some are not, and some cities are doing better than others, and it's hard to pull the data out of the trends, pull the trends out of the data. But I think it's a fair statement in most of the country, the safety of urban streets has not been improving; it's been declining. And you say, well, how could you have decline in crash rates if that's true? And it's because of those other factors. Or fatalities, not necessarily just property damage crashes. So let's look at the data a little bit, peel back some layers on the data. Most fatal crashes happen in cities, right? I mean, that would seem to make sense. That's where, you feel like you're going to be in the crashes and all that traffic in the city. And actually, I have to say, well, it's complicated. If you look at the federal data in the FARS, I'm using today, by the way, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration data sets that are part of the fatal accident reporting system. And you'll see 2013 data. There's some data that will show 2014. We do have some 2014 data, and you'll see some of our graphics actually have some 2008 data because of some research that was published in 2008. It's all current, however, and if there's something that's changing, I'll be sure and point it out. But what you'll see is that more of our crashes are taking place, these are fatalities, actual people. More of our fatalities are taking place in rural areas, which seems sort of counterintuitive. And so I want to look at that for a second. First of all, and a lot of you are planners, and so you know this, the federal government's approach to defining urban places is kind of, it is what it is, I guess. But if you think about the geography of the country, the Census Bureau clumps together what they call urban areas and urban clusters, and that's urban. And that includes our cities and our suburbs. And a lot of our ex-urban areas around our suburbs. So a lot of that, to a lot of us, would look pretty rural, but it's called urban. On the other hand, we have this rural category where we have cities and towns. Glenwood Springs is part of rural. So the terminology is kind of a problem here. When you look at the way the Census Bureau views it, about 80% of the population lives in this category that I'm showing here, urban areas, urban clusters, the urban category. It's most of the population of the country. So when you see this data, the same graph I showed you a moment ago, what you realize is that it's peculiar in a couple of ways. One, it's surprising that so many of our fatalities are occurring in rural places, and we'll talk about why that is. But it's also even more surprising when you think about cities and you realize a lot of what we're calling urban is actually not urban. It's suburban and exurban. And so, and it turns out that a lot of our crashes, and especially our personal injury and fatal crashes, are occurring not in our most urban places, but in the suburban part of the federal urban classification. Okay? Hopefully that's as geeky as I'll get today, but it's an important thing to understand because it could be confusing otherwise. Rural crash trends are coming down more steeply than urban, as I said a moment ago. And I want to talk about a couple of particular categories of exposure. Children are a major problem in our crash data. Motor vehicle, notice I still have accidents on this slide. My apologies. I'm totally dedicated to the new terminology. I just got to rebuild all my data sets. The causes of intentional injury death in children, for children 1 to 4, Motor vehicle crashes, number one. For children 5 to 9, over half are of our children who die in injury, other than being murdered or dying of disease, are dying in motor vehicle crashes. Age 14, almost 60%, and ages 15 to 19, over 3/4. It's a major cause of death in our children. It's ironic. Mayo Institute did this research a few years ago, looking at what are parents most worried about. Things like kidnapping, school snipers, terrorists, drugs. But what's actually killing kids is traffic crashes. It's an important issue for us. On a humanitarian level, on an economic level, just on a societal level, that the most dangerous thing your child does is get into a car with you. Pedestrians are also overrepresented in the database by a significant degree. You look and you say, well, they're only 14%, but when you realize that pedestrians are not actually motor vehicles, the fact that 40% of motor vehicle caused deaths are pedestrians is actually quite remarkable. And although we've had a decline over the decades in the rate of pedestrian fatalities, it actually has been on an uptick over the last 5 years or so. And so our rates of fatality among vehicle occupants has gone down more steeply than the rates among pedestrians. And as I mentioned a moment ago, that looks like it's kind of flattened out, which is, I think, a significant cause of concern. Pedestrians, the teenagers and preteens and teenagers and people in their 20s are way overrepresented in this data set in pedestrians hit by motor vehicles. These are injuries. But seniors are overrepresented in the fatality data, and people in their later decades. And that's obviously because the human body is a frail thing. It becomes increasingly frail as we age. And the ability to survive a crash goes down as we get older. So the significant trend. There's another thing that I want to call attention to because it drives me nuts as a transportation planner. I'll be talking with a client about something, I'll say, the data kind of indicates that this could have the effect of doubling the pedestrian crash rate. And they'll say, well, Jim, we've actually never had a pedestrian killed on this street. And it's what I call the scale problem. If you look at national data, we have about 15 pedestrian fatalities for every 100,000 population annually. So about 15 people out of every 100,000 die by being struck by a motor vehicle every year, and so that's like a 0.015%, right? It's a pretty tiny probability of being killed each year. So a town with a population of 1,500, a small mountain town somewhere perhaps, might expect to see one death every 5 years. And so, yeah, you say, hey, I really think you need to do something about Elk Avenue. And they'll say, well, we've never actually had a problem. We've never had anybody killed. And so it's a confounding thing. I call it the scale problem. And it makes us, I'll tell you, my experience is the first time somebody is killed, it becomes a really big deal. And I can tell stories about that. But because the crash rates are low and the fatality rates are low, we tend to underestimate how important it is. We don't remember it happening, and so it seems unlikely that it would happen. But the data indicates that it does happen, it happens a lot, and over time it has quite an impact. Another thing that we tend to believe is that the crashes, and I believe this until I started looking into it, most crashes happen at intersections. But we learned, I want to say 20, 25 years ago on a project, we started looking into the details of the data, and turns out, no, that's not the case. In fact, now this is crash data on the left here. This is all crashes, property damage, personal injury, fatality. About 64% of total crashes actually occur away from intersections. And about 3/4 of fatalities occur away from intersections. So it's not, again, it's a counterintuitive kind of thing. And part of that has to do with rural, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time today on rural accidents, but rural crashes, but there are a lot of run off the road, single vehicle crashes, alcohol-caused crashes, things like that going on in rural America and in states that have high ratio of rural miles of roadway to the population. And that's affecting this data, but there's actually some more important things going on that we want to look at. If you look at the rural fatalities, yes, it is true that a high percentage of rural fatalities are those crashes that are occurring out there on rural roadways, and just people running off the road in the middle of the night or whatever. But you also see that even for urban fatalities, over 2/3 are occurring away from intersections. So there's something there we need to pay attention to. We're going to look at it for a second. So this is a street in Boulder, and this is Iris, and you see the two intersections that I've circled. And so 31% of our crashes of our fatal fatalities, people dying, are at the intersections. So yes, we are killing people at the intersections, but interestingly, 70% are occurring at what the researchers like to call mid-block. Most of you probably are quick enough on your feet to realize that this is because we have driveways and we have turning movements, and that is part of it. In fact, that's an important part of it. But it turns out there's actually a lot of stuff going on in mid-block. And over the years, we probably have not paid enough attention to all of that. So that's it on trends and how we got to where we are. A couple of bottom line things from that. There has been an ongoing significant improvement in total fatalities and crash rates. The safety improvements, we know how we accomplished that. It wasn't by building safer streets. Most of our streets are actually not very safe and not necessarily any safer than they were 60 years ago. And we also noticed that about 2/3 of our crashes are occurring, and our fatal crashes are occurring away from intersections. Okay, so let's talk about risk factors. In a perfect world, you would think that there would be some sort of balance in how we approach these issues, that we'd be concerned about urban form and urban design, we'd be concerned about traveler safety, and we'd be concerned about function and capacity. Urban form and urban design is very important. That's been a major focus of the planning and design professions for the past 20 years or so. We're realizing that places matter, and that cities are places where we live and work, and streets are places too. And so the design matters a lot. It's worth investing in that. Certainly safety matters, and we should be spending money on that. And function and capacity is another thing that we spend money on. So in a perfect world, you'd say, well, maybe these circles wouldn't all be the same size, but there'd be some sort of balance in how we approach our investment decision making. But in fact, what it actually has looked like is this. Almost all of our investment goes into function and capacity. Very little of it goes into traveler safety, and very little of it goes into urban form and urban design, which seems peculiar to me. And I think it seems peculiar to a lot of people. It seems almost sort of radical. And I think it's a legacy of, building the country, building cities, building the highway system. We're trying to build something that does something, which is connect and provide capacity to move traffic and freight and so forth. And we didn't pay attention to these other things, and now we need to sort of refocus on these other things. To do that, there are a couple of things we need to pay a lot of attention to. One of them is the speed problem. Some of you may have seen the U-shaped curve. What this basically shows is that the likelihood of a crash occurring increases as you get greater differences in the speeds of vehicles. So if you have some vehicles going 15 miles an hour and some of them going 45, the likelihood of a crash is greater than if everybody's going exactly 35 miles an hour. That probably seems intuitive, makes sense. I know we get frustrated with the engineering profession's use of the 85th percentile criteria, which says that we're going to set our speed limits on roadways equal to the 85th percentile of actual observed speeds. That seems nuts to a lot of people. Why would you do that? That says that a lot of people are speeding. Well, we'll just raise the speed limit. That'll solve the problem. It seems crazy to do it that way. But actually, there's some logic to it. And again, it has to do with this problem of human nature. If we design roadways that people drive fast on, we get a broader dispersion of traffic. And what we need to do is to try to have less difference in the vehicle speeds if we want to reduce the crash frequency and the crash severity. And so the engineers have been focused on this for several decades now. The idea that we want to try to compress this distribution of vehicle speeds to reduce the crash rate and reduce the severity. And the data supports that sort of concept because the probability of a fatality is an exponential curve with the difference in speed. So if you crash into the rear, if you're going 70 miles an hour and you crash into the rear of a car going 15 miles an hour, the probability of fatality is much higher than if you're going 60 miles an hour and you crash into the back of a car going 59. So so that's true, and it is important. We're going to talk more about that as we go along because it turns out that there's a couple of other ways to think about that. Another thing about speed is that it kills pedestrians. Speed is terribly important in determining how likely a pedestrian is to survive and how likely it is a crash would occur in the first place. One of the reasons for that is as we drive faster, our cone of vision narrows and our ability to understand what's going on the roadside and be aware of what's going on at the crosswalk and so forth is diminished. I really like the way the new National Association of City Transportation Officials shows this in their new document, which we'll talk more about in a second. Pretty effective, I think, representation here. It's a dramatic effect. And the other part of this, of course, is that as the speed of the crash increases, the likelihood of pedestrian survival goes down dramatically, and most of us have seen this data at one time or another. I'm going to use a terminology here that I think is useful. The notion that we have streets and we have roads, and there are design principles that are appropriate for each one of those. And then we have this sort of terrible, nasty thing that's in between. It wants to be one, but it's not quite, and it's more like the other, but it shouldn't be. And Chuck Maroon at the Strong Towns, I think, has done us all a big favor by giving this kind of clever sort of contraction of those two words in strode, which sounds pretty awful, and it is. And so we have roads, and we have pretty good design criteria for how those can work, and we have streets, and we can, when we set our minds to it, we can do a pretty good job of designing those. Where we really go wrong is on these stroads. This is where a lot of our fatal accidents occur, it's where a lot of our crashes occur in the first place, a lot of our fatalities, and it's where a lot of our traffic is in our urban areas. Part of the problem is the width of these facilities, which makes them enormously dangerous for pedestrians and for cars, and for bicyclists and so forth. And the other part of the problem is speed that's associated with them. As we've seen, speed kills. The stroads have higher rates of vehicle-vehicle injuries and fatalities. They have higher rates of vehicle-pedestrian injuries and fatalities and higher rates of vehicle-bicycle injuries and fatalities. These kinds of streets are disasters for us in the safety world, and yet we have been building these busily for 60 years now, and we're still widening them. So in drilling down in street design for a second, I want to touch just really quickly on some of the concepts that I know all of you are working with. Lane widths, street widths, the value of the medians, the idea of protected bike lanes. I should have taken bike boxes out because I did take it out of the presentation. I'm not going to touch on that. I thought I wouldn't have time, and we'll talk about road diets. So lane widths and street widths ends up being an extremely important subject in the context of crash rates. What we see is that as our roads get wider, as our streets get wider, as we add lanes, the crash rates go up. I could present a lot more data on this. I'm providing you with some links here that you can, resources you can go research. But I can tell you that the data is the data's in and it's clear. As lanes get wider, crash rates go up, and as streets get wider with more lanes, crash rates go up. We also know that medians are beneficial. The medians have a beneficial impact at at a variety, at all speeds, and on all kinds of facilities. And the impact gets more and more beneficial the more intersections you have per mile. So medians are pretty much universally a safety improvement, and yet we'll frequently not build a median because we don't want to incur a more complicated snow removal regime, or we don't want to spend more money on the roadway. And there we're basically trading off something for safety, a point I'll return to later. Another important issue we're all working on are pedestrian crossings. What we see is that, as I said earlier, our pedestrians are overrepresented in our traffic data. Interestingly, as we saw with all crashes in general, a high percentage of pedestrian crashes are occurring away from intersections. Almost the same percentage as, about the same percentage as vehicle crashes. Interestingly, about 10% of pedestrian fatalities occur not on streets at all. Cars coming up on the sidewalk, they occur in parking lots and other situations, driveways. But on the streets, the distribution looks like this. And a lot of these accidents here, crashes here, fatal crashes, occur where there are no sidewalks. So that is important, but I want to look at this mid-block crossing issue just a bit more. We do, pedestrians crossing at mid-block, crossing roads and streets and stroads and at mid-block is a major source of pedestrian fatalities. It is probably the largest, it is in fact the largest single category of pedestrian fatality. But why do people do that? We have long blocks and walk distance that discourage people from going all the way down to the next traffic signal. Our intersections seem busy and dangerous, and so people avoid them, which is, not the right thing, but they do. And we have origins and destinations mid-block. Let me show you an example. This is here in Boulder, not far from where I'm sitting right now. This is 30th Street. And over here we have Rob's Music, which is a very popular music store in Boulder. And over here we have a coffee shop that is a popular coffee shop. Somebody going from one to the other, and the staff of the music store does this about twice a day, 3 times a day, probably should walk up to the signalized intersection and come back down, but they don't. Guess what they do? They do this. And so, a long block and the lack of any kind of opportunity to cross the street. 30th is a dangerous street. People drive way faster than they should. It's a 4-lane street. It's actually a 5-lane street with 2-way left turn lanes, so there's no median refuge. Dangerous street. And there we have engineering practice saying, well, they should walk up to the signal and then they should come back down the other side. And we have human nature says, well, I think I can make it across. Here's another case in Boulder. This is the Safeway store in North Boulder. This is a major intersection, obviously, of Iris and the Diagonal and North 6. And over here is a shopping center, and over here is a bunch of residential, multifamily residential. And here's the driveway from the Safeway, and we get a little bit of a piece of the sidewalk here. So guess what people are doing? Oops, sorry. They're doing this. They take advantage of this little piece of median here. They run halfway across the street, stand, look for the next gap, and run the rest of the way across the street. Now, should they do that? No. Do they? Yes. So I think we have to ask ourselves, how do we encourage unsafe mid-block crossings? And I think we do it by prioritizing traffic capacity. Our Captain May I push buttons, a lot of our signals, if you don't remember to push the button, if you didn't know there was a button there, you don't get a walk cycle, and that eventually, people should know better, but eventually they just say, I'm not going up to the intersection, I can just make it across here. We're starting to do these flashing yellow permissive left turn intervals, which I can tell you both in the data and as a person who walks a lot, make it very difficult, very problematic to walk across the street when you've got vehicles that think they have the opportunity to make a left turn. And then we also have this problem that we time our pedestrians cycle, assuming that all we have to do is get the person who's standing at the curb across the street safely. And if somebody arrives 5 seconds after that, they're not going to make it. So we time our car cycles to clear the queue. We time our pedestrian cycles to get the first person across the street. So mid-block crossings become important. They're a band-aid, admittedly. We shouldn't have long blocks with no opportunity for crossings. We shouldn't have high-speed streets that are overly wide, but we do. So we end up thinking about mid-block crossings. And, you know, where we have long blocks, where we have transit stops on the opposite side of the street, where we have T intersections, and where we have crash data. T intersections are especially problematic, where you have a major street, a side street just comes in. We tend to have a lot of pedestrian crossings there. And I'm not going to go into all the variety of treatment types we have. There's a lot of debate about all of this. We have, HOCs, and we have enhanced HOCs and so forth. But the bottom line is this. It is possible to improve mid-block safety by building and providing mid-block crossings. It's useful to have data so that we do that in the most important places and we have some basis for analyzing it. The results for high-speed multi-lane streets are mixed because we do have a problem that the car on the inside lane stops, the car on the outside lane can't see the pedestrian and doesn't stop, which is a continuing cause of fatalities at our mid-block crossings. And we also know that medians help a lot. So we do know something about this, and it is worth doing. The bottom line is we shouldn't be building any more long-block, high-speed multi-lane streets. They're killers, and we know that. Turns out speed kills bicyclists too, obviously. And one of the topics that I know many of you have been working on or thinking about debating are protected bike lanes, cycle tracks. And, again, it's this human nature problem. You think, well, you've got a bike lane out there. It seems like a simple matter that the bike's in the bike lane, the car's in the car lane. But we're dealing with human nature, and people are what they are. And so this is, I think, one of our more common accident types in Boulder is not necessarily texting, but somebody crossing the line into the bike lane and striking a bicyclist who's where they were supposed to be. It turns out the protected bike lane data is conclusive. The New York experience shows, interestingly, that not only does it greatly improve bicycle safety, it actually increases pedestrian safety too. For those of you who are interested in that, I suggest you dig out this report and read it. We all owe a lot to Jeanette Sadiq-Khan in New York for charging into this as bravely as they did, because we're learning a lot from it. The experience around the country has just been universal. Protected bike lanes improve safety. The hierarchy is as we go from no sidewalks and no bike lanes to multi-use parallel pathways to bike lanes on street to protected bike lanes. It's a straight up 9 times safer journey there. Another thing that I know that people are wrestling with in design and thinking about is something that we've now built hundreds of miles of in the United States, although it somehow manages to continue to be controversial, are road diets. These are lane reduction projects where we take a 4-lane road, this is the most common type, a 4-lane road converted to a 4-lane street converted to a 3-lane street, add either parking or bike lanes or both on each side. There's now a very useful federal report on this, which I'm showing you here. By the way, this presentation will be posted up, obviously, on the Community Builder site. So I'm trying to design these so that you can go do your own research if you'd like. This report is very useful, as it turns out. Reports data from Michigan, where they have an overall 32% reduction in crash rates from lane conversions from the road diets. Examples from around the country. Pasadena, significant improvements on this project. Reston, this is sort of a suburban, one of our worst, most dangerous kinds of streets, very successful, 70% reduction in crash rate. Bottom line is that lane reduction road diets improve safety. In some cases, they do increase congestion and delay. Usually not significantly, but they do. And in some cases, they'll cause a diversion of traffic to other streets. So road diets can be controversial because the car drivers don't want to have longer queues and don't want to have increased delay. And so we have to ask ourselves, what's the trade-off? Are we willing to trade some safety improvement, which appears to be pretty significant, for some increased delay and congestion? And oftentimes the answer is no, we don't want to. So that's kind of a quick survey of crash factors, design factors. I want to talk about a couple of other things quickly that I know that are especially frustrating and they're things about which I think are generally misinformed. First of these is the AASHTO greenbook. It's sort of like the document that everybody loves to hate, and I think largely because it's misrepresented most of the time. I want to kind of expose some of that. A couple of things on what I call greenbook mythology. You'll hear people saying the Federal Highway Administration requires adherence to greenbook standards in federally funded projects. I was told this 2 weeks ago, as recently as 2 weeks ago, by a traffic engineer in a city. It's not true. It hasn't been true for a while. It hasn't been true for 20 years. The federal government does not require adherence to greenbook in federally funded projects. If your state DOT or your local public works person is still saying that, it's not true. Greenbook requires 12-foot lanes. We all have heard that, and that's not true either. It turns out that the Greenbook actually talks about lane widths in a pretty analytical way. And it actually says in one point a lane should not be built wider than it needs than you can demonstrate a need for. And so it's important to realize that these are debatable things. These are things that should be the subject of analysis, not subject of some sort of broad statement that we have to build 12-foot lanes. There's some shortcomings in the Greenbook that I think are puzzling. Hopefully they'll eventually get resolved. One of these is you may be aware of this. There's a Greenbook takes the position that commercial land uses should be placed on your arterials, your major streets. And you know, maybe in somebody's mind that makes sense, but in the real world, a lot of our neighborhoods serving commercial spaces on our local streets, and that's good for us. That works well. Greenbook says that we should predict traffic out 30 years and build for out 20 years and build for the 30th highest hour. We all know that doesn't make sense. That just prioritizes capacity over those other objectives, and it induces traffic. Greenbook says that parking for land uses along arterial streets should not be provided in the streets, should be provided in off-street facilities. That doesn't make any sense either. We know that on-street parking is a safety factor. It encourages lower speeds. We get some minor increase in fender benders, significant improvements in personal injuries and fatalities. Street trees, we've got to get those street trees out of the way. Can't have streets, can't have shade because you might run into them with your cars. That's the Greenbook position. Again, data doesn't support that. Street trees encourage lower speeds. They actually encourage safer conditions. Collisions with trees on urban streets are rarely. Here's the data. Fatal crashes that in cities resulting, 75 miles an hour on the interstate, you go off the side of the road. If you hit a tree, that's probably not a good thing. So you won't have trees in your ditches on your interstate highways. But in a city, a very tiny percentage of urban fatalities result from crashes with roadside trees. It's really not a factor at all. Next time somebody says that, just chuckle. The Greenbook's approach to fixed objects in general is based on it's a rural highway. It's basically a document we have that was developed over 50 to 80 years of working on rural highways. It does not help us a lot in city design. The Greenbook's emphasis on street hierarchy and is almost silent on connectivity. We know now that that's wrong, that connectivity is one of the most important things in safety. The research that Wes Marshall and Norm Garrick have done gives us good data on that. Greenbook says that we should base our land use decisions on street type, and we know that's not right either, that we should do it the other way around. The street should take on the context, should take on design characteristics based on the context that it's in. We have research from Florida by Eric Dumbaugh that many of you are probably aware of that shows that in fact you take a street that's similar in almost every way. The same street, same traffic levels, same length of street, and the proportion that has storefronts and a busy street side and on-street parking has significantly safer than the same street a couple miles away with the same traffic level, but has that strode design. So where the Greenbook succeeds is here. This is I-70 coming down from Eisenhower Tunnel. The guardrails, the shoulders, the geometric design of the roadway, the pavement markings, this stuff is all much better than it was, even when I was just starting out as a transportation planner. Big kudos for the improvements we've made there. But the Green Book fails in most respects in our cities, in our urban street planning and design process. There are good guides out there. CNU, UOI, this document is it's a little thick, and it can be a little hard to find your way around in it, but the data is solid. It's accurate. Many states, it is an ITE recommended practice now. Many states do recognize this. But I think the big innovation has been the NACTO's new urban street design guide. If you don't have this, you should get it. It is, in my opinion, authoritative and clear and extremely well done and very useful. Some states now are allowing use of this as a design basis for urban streets. NACTO's also done a pretty good urban bikeway design guide. I'd recommend that to you. And FHWA has published, Federal Highway Administration has published a pretty exhaustive piece of research on pedestrian safety. And I think these are all readily available, free, that you can obtain and use. What's missing is guidance on semi-autonomous and autonomous vehicles, which is unfortunate because we're probably going to see some significant safety benefits, primarily from the semi-autonomous improvements, lane keeping, crash avoidance, and so forth. Potentially up to a 40% reduction in crash rate. Okay, and I want to sort of close out now by making a couple of points about data. To make my point, I'm showing you data from the interior west states. So this is fatality rate per, it's the exposure rate, fatality rate per 100,000 population. Notice the difference between states. And you think you might be able to explain it. You might say, well, Montana, that's pretty rural. So that's what's, they don't have a lot of population, they have a lot of miles of highway. And they got interstates, so maybe that's what's going on there. But then you look at the pedestrian fatality rate, that seems very high in Montana and New Mexico as well. And then you look at the fatality rate per mile of travel, and now some of the other trends, Montana's still high, but some of the other states kind of take different positions. My point about this data is that we don't pay enough attention to it. This data is telling us things about our street networks that we should be paying attention to. There are reasons why there are, for example, a very low pedestrian fatality rate in Wyoming and a high percentage of fatalities occurring in rural roadways. Yes, alcohol matters, but if you look at this graph, what it kind of shows is it might, yes, the alcohol rate is a little higher in Montana, a little lower in Utah. You kind of expect that. But it doesn't really seem to be dramatic enough to be driving those other trends. So what gets measured gets done. This data matters, and we don't see much data. And we should measure what's important. What's important is crash data and the system data that goes with it. An entertaining example of that is the Texas death calendar, people call it. Where they have, and it's not funny, but the joke is they've never used the Deathless Day symbol yet. They haven't had an opportunity to use that yet. But reporting matters. Colorado's about to do some new reporting on its roadway messaging signs on how many cumulative fatalities we have each year. Okay, so I'll wrap up. So we've covered a lot of ground. I started out on a controversial note saying why everybody talks about traffic safety, transportation safety, but nobody does anything about it. It's not entirely fair. But what we see is that we really haven't been spending our resources there. We've been spending our resources on capacity and throughput and speeds to the detriment of safety. And that a more balanced approach would seem, prudent, at least to me. We now have this Vision Zero trend, which a number of state DOTs and a number of U.S. cities are starting to sign on to, which is a pretty radical statement. It says you would never do that. It says you would always prioritize life and health over all those other things. And that's pretty radical. We'll see if we're serious about it. Most of the stuff that's been adopted so far is just really kind of lip service to it. We'll see if the actual implementation measures follow from that. So some rules of thumb that what we've covered. First of all, these are, I only have 5 of them because I'm only using them if I know for sure they're true and if they're universal. Wider lanes, increased number of lanes, increased crash rates, and increased crash severity. As you widen your streets, you're making them less safe, period. You do not make streets safer. This is a pet peeve of mine because I've listened to so many project managers say this over the years. We're widening the road to make it safer. We are reducing congestion because congestion is unsafe. Congestion is not unsafe. Congestion is unsafe to sheet metal. When we have high congestion, we get a lot of fender-bender accidents. When we quote-unquote solve that problem by widening the street, adding turn lanes and so forth, we get not more safety, we get more personal injuries and fatalities. So congestion reduction is not the same thing as safety improvement, period. We've seen now that building bike lanes, especially protected bike lanes, clearly improves bicycle safety and, interestingly, pedestrian safety as well because of the changes it causes to the geometry of the street and the length of the street crossing and so forth. There's enough data in on this now over enough decades that we need to stop debating it. Bike lanes improve safety, and protected bike lanes really improve safety. Medians do what we always thought they would do. They improve safety. They reduce both the crash rates and crash severity. Medians are a smart investment. Why don't we build more of them? And streets like this that, you might look at and say, boy, there's a lot going on there. We're probably going to have some crashes are actually much safer than those big wide roads. Much, much safer, period. Okay, so, and then wrapping up, remember this, where we seem to get in trouble is where we think we can impose some sort of engineering-based or design-based logic on our facilities that runs contrary to human nature. And when we do that, we get crashes and we get injuries and fatalities. And with that, Allison, I will wrap up a couple minutes late and turn back to you.
Thanks. We do have a bunch of questions, so I'm going to throw out a handful of them, as many as we can, before the top of the hour. And if we have extra, Jim has agreed to stay a little bit longer if we need to. So I will start right in. This one came in early on when you were showing the VMT trends over the last several decades. The question is, haven't VMT per person dropped in the past decade?
Yes. VMT per person in the United States actually began dropping in the year 2000. We weren't paying much attention to it until about 2006 when total VMT started to drop. And we kind of went, whoa, what's going on here? And we started peeling back the layers, looking at the data, and realized that per capita VMT had been dropping for a while already. It wasn't just the recession. It wasn't just the high fuel prices that we had in 2006 and 2007. And when we had our big recession and our fuel prices dropped, or stayed high there for a while and then dropped, we had a reduction in VMT across the board and a pretty steep reduction in VMT per capita. And that is probably a long-term trend. Our millennials are driving less. They're owning fewer cars. People are making less money. They have less income. They're inclined to avoid driving if they can. Our nation is urbanizing. More people are living in cities, but they have options to drive. To driving. And so, yes, VMT per capita appears to have flattened out. Now, in the last 2 years, we've had very cheap gas since late 2014, and consequently, we've seen a surge in driving, both total driving and, in most states, in a return to increases in per capita VMT. I don't think that's a long-term trend. I think that, first of all, the causes of the decline in per capita VMT that we saw up until about 2014 or so are due to lower underlying factors. They're due to economics. They're due to culture. People are going to drive less. Driving is so 1950s. And that trend is going to continue. But we also have a growing population. We have a huge increase in truck traffic. That's leveled off a little bit, actually, in the past couple of years as a part of some other trends. But I think yes, VMT per capita is definitely not going to increase at the rate that we saw it increasing in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. But it's easy to overstate that, which the media does. You read the newspapers and you think that there's probably no cars left out there. But the fact is that our traffic has been growing. Traffic grew from 2014 to 2015 significantly across the country. And so it's going to take a while for that to really feel like a decrease. Right now, traffic is still growing.
Okay, I have a question from Flo about driver's ed. She's saying that there's a debate on the merit of driver training for all students. Some states require it at the high school level, but Colorado, for example, has not provided driver's ed in high school for several decades. What did the stats say about the effectiveness of driver's ed?
I don't know. I didn't research that. It's not part of my work. I'm sorry, I just don't actually know the answer to that question.
Okay. Okay, another question. This came in early on too. With all the transportation safety material available from the FHWA, for example, safety audits, why don't more communities use that information?
Well, thank you for pitching me that gigantic softball. I appreciate it. This is, I don't know. You tell me. We had an experience 10 years ago where we had urban clients, sophisticated cities, smart people, doing a good job. And I said, hey, let's look at your traffic safety data. Let's look at your crash record. And you're like, well, we're not actually compiling them. And I said, well, where are they? And they were, you know the story. They're in boxes in the basement of the police department. We were working in a western state here recently, and we wanted to show some crash trends related to how this whole question of is BMT dropping, is that why the crash rate is going down? So we wanted current data on it. And the answer was, well, the DOT is processing that data for us. We send all our police reports to the DOT, and they enter the data, but they're 4 years behind. So the latest data we have is, I think it was like 2007 or 8 or something. So it's, I don't know. I mean, I think it's important. We're doing a project right now with, CU has a capstone program with their graduate degree in urban planning requires students to do a capstone project. And we always try to provide one of those for one of the students. And so we're working with a student who's going to do a capstone project to design a safety dashboard that cities could implement using the data, so that you could have up on your website the facts about what is actually happening. Are we more safer than the other cities in the country? Are we less safe? Are we seeing an increase in pedestrian fatalities? Because we don't generally have access to that data. We had a big fist fight here in Boulder, a metaphorical fist fight, political fist fight, last fall over some proposed protected bike lanes on a facility, and everybody driving in Boulder these days seems to be angry and in a hurry, and people didn't want to slow down, didn't want to have the queues be a little bit longer, and didn't think the bike safety was important. The notable thing to me about that debate was the lack of any data about safety. What I would say is, if you're a city planner or urban planner or a consultant that does work for them, or certainly an engineer, go looking for the data. It's a different story in every city. In some cities, the accident reports are being compiled and entered into a database, but nobody's using the database. In some cities, the data is just going in the cardboard boxes and go down the basement of the police station and get thrown out every 10 years. Some states, they're getting boxed up and sent, in Front Range here, they get sent to Dr. Cog, the Denver Regional Council of Governments, and they do a pretty good job of compiling and producing the data. It's different everywhere, and it's very important, and it's completely not enough attention is paid to this. And this is a personal crusade I'm going to be on for the rest of my career. We need to get the data, put it in a format where we can understand it, and make it available for decision makers.
Okay, so we do have a bunch more questions, and it is the top of the hour. I just want to make a couple announcements, as I noticed a few people are leaving, and then we'll get back and, like I said, Jim's agreed to stay for a few extra minutes, so hopefully we can get to most of the questions, if not all. So just a few sort of business things we have to take care of here, but as people leave, I do want to remind folks that the PowerPoint slides and the recording of today's webinar will be posted on our website, which is there on your screen, communitybuilders.org/webinars. So look for it there. I'll post links to all the resources that Jim mentioned as well. We also have information about upcoming webinars there. Next month we have Tim Walsworth, Executive Director for Durango, Colorado's Downtown Business Improvement District, and he'll be sharing some creative approaches to community partnerships. In March, we will have Sarah McKinley from the Democracy Collaborative, and she'll be discussing their newly released report, which is called Cities Building Community Wealth, and it's about the role of cities in economic development. And looking forward to 2016, we have lots of exciting plans for webinars, including a look at housing and affordability in the Rocky Mountain West. We're currently seeking underwriters for the 2016 Community Builders webinar series. So if you or your company are interested in becoming an underwriter, you can contact me at allison@communitybuilders.org, or you can provide your contact information on our survey, which will pop up as you exit the webinar. If you are a planner receiving continuing education credits for today's session, this counts for one AICP certification maintenance credit with the American Planning Association. Today's webinar is event number 9007706. To redeem your credits, log on to your profile on the APA website and find this webinar in the calendar. And for other professionals who would like to receive a certificate of attendance for this webinar, you can provide your email address in our survey, or you can drop me a line at my email address there on the screen, and I will send you out a certificate of attendance. I try to get to those later today. And also, for those of you that are in our region, which is Colorado, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, I wanted to let you know about an opportunity from our New Mobility West initiative. New Mobility West provides direct technical assistance to communities in our region to address specific challenges or opportunities at the crossroads of transportation and community development. Assistance will be awarded through a competitive application process, and we're accepting applications through March 18th. So if you'd like to receive an application which has more information about this process on it, you can share your email address in our survey. And again, that's only for the communities in our region of Colorado, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. Finally, our survey also has a few questions about the quality of this session and about future topics that we might be discussing. So please let us know what you think. We highly value your feedback. You can always email me feedback as well, and you can stay in touch with us on social media through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We hope to keep the conversation going, and we'd love to stay in touch with you. All right, so that's it for that. Jim, we do have some more questions. Folks, you can still type your questions into the questions panel if you have some more. So let me get back in without further ado. I have a question from Chris for Jim. He's asking, how do we define suburban? Is it a land use description or a street density and layout description?
Well, that's a great question. To answer the question in a straightforward way first, I think the most useful way to define suburban is to use measures of density and measures of street connectivity together. Maybe I wouldn't have said that 15 or 20 years ago, but we're having some strange phenomena now. I could show you a photo, probably pull a photo up on the computer here, but we're seeing what we call dense sprawl and so forth. So I don't think there's not an official definition that I think matters. What we know is that urban places work as urban places and rural places work as rural places, and small towns and cities and rural areas work. Where we get into trouble with a lot of these issues is in our suburban areas. And it's because the driving per capita is so much higher there. The walking is so difficult. Because of where they sit in the region, there's a lot of driving, not just internally, but through them. I don't want to try to go on record saying here's the definition of suburban place, but I do agree with Chris, your suggestion that it includes elements both of street connectivity and overall density. I think maybe another variable there that a lot of urban planners would want to have you thinking about too is land use mix. One of the sort of defining characteristics of much of suburbia is that it's residential only and that the commercial is sort of concentrated into a few small areas, most of them far away from where people live. So it's some combination of land use mix and density and roadway network. The important thing at my desk is that it was only about 15 years ago that we began to realize how important road connectivity was to the whole question. And once we started to peel back the layers and look into the data and think about what do we gain from improved connectivity, the data is dramatic, as you probably know. So, yeah, those are the three things.
Okay, I have a question from Carol. She's asking, do crash rates go up on congested rural roads and highways when they get wider?
Again, we have this terrible terminology of urban, suburban, rural, and what is rural. If what we mean by rural is let me see, can I generalize about that? I think that crash rates on rural highways that are truly rural, they're not in suburban areas, they're not part of metropolitan regions, are not significantly, well, man, that's a tough one. Two-lane highways, we do have data that shows that providing passing lanes on two-lane highways is a safety improvement. It does, the percentage, the number of accidents, crashes in a year where somebody head-on into somebody else passing a car is not many, but it's a terrible type of crash to have, and we do get safety improvements out of passing lanes. Four-laning highways is almost never done in rural areas because of capacity constraints. It's almost always done as a sort of an economic development kind of strategy. Highway 20 across northern Iowa would be a good example. Freeways, you're going to see, if you have a rural congested freeway somewhere, and I guess, let's say 90 or 80 rather across southern Wyoming can feel kind of congested sometimes. If you added lanes to that, and they have in a couple of places, in the rural, very, very rural kinds of areas, if you added lanes, you probably would see some small reduction in crash rate. You probably would not see an increase in the speed profile, in part because there's pretty rigorous enforcement out there in that highway, and in part because it's already pretty fast. I think that's a tough question. I don't know. I think there may be like a question behind the question, so I'll wait and see if that comes in too.
Okay, I'll keep an eye out. Well, she did follow up saying rural as in I-70, state highways into the Front Range. Does that help?
Yeah, I think that I don't think I could say. I don't think anybody could say. I think it's very specific. I-70 is a very specific kind of facility, and it's congested because of specific things that are happening. In large part, it becomes, as the person asking the question knows, it becomes congested because of the combination of pass-through traffic and recreational traffic and local traffic, and it becomes episodically crowded in certain conditions. These serious accidents, the fatalities, are not occurring because of congestion. They're occurring because of speed and speed differentials and poor decision making. So recently, Colorado DOT has introduced managed lanes on the shoulders. They're toll lanes. Their tolls are variable. They are only open at some points in time, and those are having a significant in many days so far since they've been open. They've had a significantly beneficial effect on the congestion, amount of delay, the average speed of the traffic. My guess is that when the data is in, and it's not yet, what it will show is that the number of rear-end collisions, which is the most common kind of collision out there, there has been probably a reduction in rear-end collisions because people just don't, you're tired from skiing all day, you're not paying enough attention, you run into the person in front of you. But I doubt very much that we're going to see any improvement in personal injury or fatality rates as a result of that capacity improvement.
Okay, so a question from Chris saying, most of the Strode images you show include curb walks. Have there been studies into whether placing cars and people in proximity contributes to the problem of safety? And how can we get real sidewalks with separation?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, there is data showing that providing some separation between the sidewalk and the curb improves safety. But realize that the number of pedestrians who are struck by motor vehicles in the sidewalk is a pretty small percentage of the total pedestrian injuries and fatalities out there. And I mean, that's just what the data is. And so, again, it's that scale problem. Could you improve safety by 25% by providing a separation? Yeah. But what does that turn out to in terms of actual numbers of accidents? It might be, instead of killing one person every 15 years, you'd kill a half a person every 15 years. So there's a problem, in terms of just the scale. But yeah, they're safer. They're certainly more comfortable. The question of how do you go about establishing some sort of a furnishing strip or a parkway strip between the sidewalk and the street, that's a subject of a webinar in itself. But what I would say, looking back at what we talked about today, is that one of the easiest and best ways to do that is through road diets. Our streets are too wide and our lanes are too wide. We have I can't tell you the number of cases in the past just year that we've been working on a project and we say, well, how wide is this street? And we realize we have a 2-lane street that's like 32 feet wide, or 40 feet wide. Or we have lanes that are 14 feet wide and we say, why are there 14-foot lanes? And nobody remembers why that choice was made. So there's lots of opportunity out there. I think. Now, it's expensive because when you move curb lines, you're changing drainage, and drainage is one of the more expensive parts of reconstructing streets. But there are opportunities. If you look at it from the point of view of the data and just thinking about, when we rebuild a street, what should we do with it? Road diets are a good way to come up with that right of way that you need to provide that parkway strip.
Okay, also quickly, I guess, on the question of stroads, Patricia's wondering if the term stroads is your term or if it's an accepted term in the vernacular of traffic planning.
Well, it's a good question, and I probably should have made this point more clearly. I did make the point, but what I would say is, no, it's not official, although it's starting to become almost official because we're all using it. It was coined by a guy named Chuck Marone, who has an organization he calls Strong Towns, and there's a site on the slide where I introduced that word. That's worth going to. Chuck's doing some really creative work. He's got some good people working for him now, and it's really useful stuff. But no, it's not a technical term. You won't find the term stroad in the AASHTO greenbook. Yeah.
Okay, from Wesley, short blocks create more crossing opportunities for pedestrians and decrease mid-block crossings, but short blocks also create more conflict zones for separated bike facilities. Can you comment on the trade-off?
Yeah, it is a trade-off. What I would say, though, is that I think that we have done enough protected bikeway design now that what our actual experience has been is that the problem is not the frequency of intersections, it's the driveways. Where we find it very difficult to do protected bike lanes is where we have driveways every 50 feet. I mean, it's basically impossible to do a good protected bike lane in that situation. It's not impossible. Please don't quote me saying it's impossible, but it's hard. But I don't think the street network is that big a deal. It would surprise me to find that somebody thought that was the case. The ideal sort of connectivity in an urban street network is about 350 feet. Your block's about 350 feet on the side. Some of you are familiar probably with LEAD-ND, and there's a couple of approaches in there for calculating all of that. All the way up to 500 or 600 feet is, pretty good. 350 is sort of ideal. At 350 feet, you have plenty of room to deal with the approach to the intersection, plenty of room to deal with whether there's a right turn lane and so forth. So I don't think the street network is a barrier to protected bike lanes. Driveways are. Are we still connected?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I think I lost my audio for a second there. I have a few more questions. Do you have a few more minutes or?
Sure.
Okay, great. So, yeah, I think it's just about 3. So I have a question from Marina. She's asking about slow zones where speeds are limited to 20 miles per hour. She asks, what can you tell us about communities adopting slow zones, and are there many communities that are doing that?
Well, they're extremely common in school zones now. I think just about everybody's doing school zones. I think they're pretty effective. I think we were all a little nervous about them maybe whenever it was we started doing them 20 years ago or so, worried about, remember that curve I showed of what really matters in crash severity is the differential in the speed. So if you got some people going 20 and some people going 60, and that happens. I certainly, driving in Boulder, I get passed in a school zone all the time by somebody who's either not paying attention or doesn't care. So there is a big differential there. But I think the data, I haven't seen a lot of data on this. I think there has been some data on school zones per se that shows that the crash rates are better and that certainly the severity is improved. I think pedestrian safety is improved as well, in part because of the lower, just the fact you do have lower average speeds. I think that if you're going to do slow zones, it's absolutely important that you have some level of enforcement. And I don't mean like once a year. I mean, you need to focus some enforcement on it. And, you know, what happens, and I've seen this in a couple of different cities, I've actually seen it happen, is that when you first begin introducing slow zones, there's maybe a lot of people are like, well, you know, I'm not going to pay any attention to that, or they don't notice it, or they think, nobody's enforcing it. Once you start to enforce it and people realize, oh, I don't want to get a ticket, you know, it's like going to be really expensive, and so I'm going to, and pretty soon most of the vehicle stream is doing that, then pretty soon it becomes culturally the thing that you should do. And I think we're sort of at that point in Boulder now. It's like, if somebody zips through one of the school zones at 40 miles an hour, it's like everybody's going, what a jerk, you know, it doesn't even care about the safety of kids. So I think culturally, you know, you do the enforcement early on and really, you know, keep the heat on and make it work, and then gradually it just becomes how we do things. But I'm not sure if you're thinking about slow zones in some other context.
She did follow up to say, what about in downtowns? Do any towns are doing that in their downtown area?
Well, sure. I mean, the speed of traffic in downtowns is a continual debate everywhere. And what I hope you could get out of the presentation today is that we should design downtown streets as if we thought they were going to be slow streets. We should have small streets. We should have on-street parking. We should have a good tight grid. We should do things physically. We should have street trees, and we should do things physically. If we need a median, we've got a 4-lane street in a downtown area. Let's think about doing a median. All of those things slow the cars down. If you build a street that looks like you should be driving 60 miles, or you could drive 60 miles an hour on it, and you post it for 20 miles an hour, it's not going to work. The engineers are going to go nuts because they know they're going to start getting some really severe crashes. So what we have to do is design for low speeds, and then we can post for low speeds. But we can't design facilities for high speeds and then post them for low speeds. It doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have a question from Renee. Do you have any suggestions if your state DOT says that crash and collision data and location is confidential and this isn't available to the public?
Oh, if you hear in that, you should call a lawyer. That's baloney. It's public information by definition. Now, you may not. I'm not sure what somebody may have been told there. Somebody may have asked for specific details of a specific accident, and some of that may in fact be confidential. But no, data about how many crashes have we had at the intersection of Broadway and Iris, how many of them were pedestrians, how many fatalities were there, what's the average blood alcohol content, that's all public information by definition. And so if you get that, file a Freedom of Information request. FOIA them, as my wife would say.
Okay, I think this is it. The last one. Is it possible to put a protected bike lane in the center of the street, maybe alongside the median?
You know, we're not seeing much of that in the United States. You do see it in, obviously, those of you who've been to Amsterdam and Copenhagen and other places in Europe, you do see them there. You see bike medians and stuff. You know, maybe we haven't tried to do that in our practice. You know, there are some pros and cons. We could talk about it for quite a while. I don't want to take too much of people's time. I mean, certainly, one of the problems you have with protected bike lanes in cities is how do you handle left turns? And one of the appeals of trying to do a protected bike lane in the middle of the street is that you could, you know, that kind of deals with that problem. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that they're used that way in Western Europe. But realize that your speeds in Western Europe are a lot lower, and the driver behavior is a lot different too. And it does, you know, you think you'd get away from the driveway problem, and I guess you would. but now you have the problem that the bike is on the inside, and how do they get to the land users on the outside of the lane? I don't, it's a good question, and I'm not opposed to the concept, and I'll bet before everything's all over, we'll end up designing one of those somewhere. But I haven't seen one in the United States, and so maybe something we could do is if somebody is aware of one of those that they think is working well, we could maybe make that available to people. Maybe send it to me or send it to Allison, and we'll get it up as part of the follow-up from the webinar.
Great. Yeah, I could certainly do that. I will be putting together a page for this webinar later this afternoon. So with all of the recording and the resources and the PowerPoint, so folks can tune in there for additional information. And thanks, Jim, for staying extra long and answering all our questions. That was great.
Thanks to our audience. Hi, everybody. Appreciate you being part of it and hanging with us. We've done, 9 of these now, Allison?
I think about 9 is what we counted, yeah. So it's been great. And we don't have anything further scheduled with Jim right now. We will release him from his obligations, but hopefully we will have him back in the future as, as future topics come up. So thanks again, Jim, for your participation in the webinar series. And thanks to our whole audience for sticking around extra long today. That was great. We had a lot of people really stick with us. Please take our survey. Let us know what you thought. And with that, I will wrap it up. Thanks to everyone, and have a great day.